Did it, the books, the bid it, the books, the did it, the books, books. All right, welcome back to I'll Read It Eventually. Today I'm going to be talking about a book, a biography called Alexander, God, King, Man by Edmund Richardson. Cover on my e-reader. See, it goes dark. I don't know how to make it stay light, but that is what it looks like. Um, Really interesting portrait of him. Like, it's probably a Renaissance painting. I don't know. Richardson is a professor of classics at Durham, University of Durham in the UK. Associate professor, his bio says. So I guess he's not a big fish, I suppose. I've never heard of him. But I guess maybe he felt like Alexander the Great was such well-trodden territory that, there was enough for him to cut his teeth on a book and not have to really dig into something new. Although, to be fair, he does actually dig into a lot of new stuff. For instance, he quotes a an Egyptian priest who was present and is actually the only first person account in existence of the Battle of Issus, which is one of Alexander the Great's major set piece battles against the forces of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. So, yeah, and that's really cool. That was just deciphered within the last decade, I think, 2016 or something like that. I think the guy's name is Somtutefnacht or something like that. But yeah, he was present and fought on the battlefield at Issus. Um, saw his comrades cut to ribbons by the Macedonian phalanx, and then he collapsed and passed out from exhaustion and trauma and woke up among the corpses of the slain. So that's as close as you can get. So anyway, the reason that I was reading this book particularly is I just discovered or stumbled upon a website called NetGalley. For those of you who are not super bookish people, a galley copy is like an early review copy of a book, and NetGalley is just an online resource to get early review copies to readers. So I got this book for free. It is an early review copy of the book, but it's pretty finished and pretty polished. I only noticed a couple minor typographical errors and things like that. So it was pretty polished there. I think it was missing like maps and a couple other things, front and back material, but the narrative was all there, and really good, I would say, overall. So I received it for free. NetGalley as a website functions on the assumption that about 80% of the time when someone receives a book, they will offer a review of that book. So not being paid to review the book, it just looked interesting, and it was one of several that I requested, and it was one of two that I actually got a copy of. So, and I'll probably be reading and reviewing that other one sometime in the next couple months. So anyway, Alexander, God, King, Man. I cannot keep those three straight. For the longest time while I was reading it, I thought it was Man, King, God, which makes a lot more sense to me, because that's sort of the progression of his life. But I guess maybe as you're digging back through the legend of Alexander the Great, maybe that's where you end up. I don't know. So two things really quick, and then let's talk about what I thought of the book. Number one, why read another biography of Alexander the Great? One, two, I've read two modern biographies of Alexander, and I've read the Anabasis of Arrian, which is one of the later ancient biographies, and then I've read Quintus, Curtius, Rufus, and the campaigns of Alexander, and then I've read Plutarch's Life of Alexander. So I've read five biographies of Alexander the Great. That's what happens when you study history in college, ancient history specifically, emphasis on ancient history. So, why read another one? And I would say two reasons. Number one, the cover I thought was pretty arresting. Then number two, some of the advertising copy sort of implied to me that it was going to analyze Alexander psychologically, at least a little bit, which is obviously sort of a difficult thing to do at 2,300 years remove from the events, but nevertheless, that was sort of what I understood the book was going to be. It didn't really turn out that way, or at least I would say if that's what the author thinks he's accomplished, it's not quite up to snuff in that area, but in most other areas, I thought it was really good. So that was thing number one before I talk about what I thought of the book. Thing number two is, for the layperson, what do I need to know about Alexander the Great? So, as quickly as I can, here's what you need to know about Alexander the Great. I talked a couple videos ago about the original Anabasis of Xenophon. Alexander the Great lives about 70 years later after those events. So he comes of age around 330 BC, and that's when his war really begins. He is one of the children of Philip II of Macedon, which is sort of like a backcountry hillbilly Greek kingdom. It's so backcountry and hillbilly that most Greeks would say, yeah, Macedonians aren't Greek. They speak a language that is so close to Greek and yet so far. Regular Greeks thought of them as speaking with an accent, thought of them as uncultured. Again, hillbillies. It's the it's the Appalachia of Greece. So they were not well thought of. He's one of the sons, the eldest son, well, second eldest son of Philip II of Macedon. And Philip II of Macedon, a real brawler and fighter of a king. He expands Macedon from this tiny little kingdom with like a rabble of an army and basically no respect on a Mediterranean scale to a fairly large kingdom in its own right with a highly professional army and quite a bit of prestige. He brings the entirety of the Greek peninsula to heel and makes them subject to Macedon, particularly 338, I believe it is, at the Battle of Chaeronea, which is Alexander's sort of first real taste of a set-piece battle. Philip II brings the Greeks to heels, particularly Athens and Thebes. They're leading a coalition against him, and he absolutely demolishes them at Chaeronea, and Alexander is integral to the victory, the Macedonian victory at the Battle of Chaeronea. So, his father, Philip II, is assassinated a couple of years later, and he comes to power in the midst of that violence. There's some conjecture that maybe he planned it or orchestrated it, or his mother planned and orchestrated it. He and his father did not get along. Philip at one point tried to kill him in a drunken rage at a party, in front of hundreds of people, drew a sword and was about to murder him. And then Philip was so drunk that he tripped and fell down. And Alexander is reputed to have said he intends to cross from Greece to Asia, conquer Asia, and yet he cannot cross from one couch to another. And then Alexander, fled out of the room before Philip got up and stabbed him. So it's a good piece of comedy, but you gotta get the heck out. And so he comes to power right after his father dies. He cements his rule. He kills a couple of people, and then Alexander sets out on what was almost certainly his father's long-held plan to invade the Persian Empire. And it's not clear what scale ultimately Philip II had in mind for an invasion of the Persian Empire. But ultimately, as most people I think know, Alexander's attempt to fight the Persians and conquer a portion of the Persian Empire ultimately led him to conquer the entire Persian Empire, become a ruler of it, and then extend its borders, particularly eastward, in a lightning campaign. So Alexander crosses over into Asia in 333 BC. He fights a number of large battles with first Persian governors, and then eventually with Darius III, the Emperor of Persia, the last Persian Emperor of Persia, the last Achaemenid Persian Emperor. Um, so he fights the Battle of the Granicus River, wins that by throwing himself into the middle of the battle and basically dragging his army in with him. He fights Darius himself at the Battle of Issus, which is where that Egyptian priest, almost dies and then pens a first-person narrative of the battle. And then he conquers the cities of Tyre and Gaza, which are both those sieges are recounted in the book. And then he marches into Egypt. Egypt basically just throws open the gates to him. They love him and they hate the Persians. And then he goes, quite famously, to the oasis of Siwa, which is today, I think, in Libya, the country of Libya, but at the time was considered to be a part of Egypt. It's in the middle of the desert. I mean, there's nothing around. It's like 200 miles across the Sahara Desert to reach this oasis. And while he's there, he has a religious experience in a temple at Siwa, where the god Amun Ra, according to Alexander, or at least Alexander doesn't fight the notion, Amun Ra declares that Alexander is his son. And so Alexander effectively becomes a god in Egypt. He's enthroned as the Pharaoh of Egypt, which would also, in the eyes of its people, that would also make him a god. Pharaohs were considered to be, if not deities, at least close enough that it really didn't matter. They dispensed the power of the gods on earth and were a direct conduit to them. So at a certain point, the difference between God and man bleeds into non-existence with Egyptian pharaohs for ancients. And then, of course, if one of these gods is declaring him his son, then he becomes a god to all intents and purposes, for the people he's ruling. He spends some time in Egypt, and then he marches up out of Egypt back into Syria, and then down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers into the heartland of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Darius III has gathered this huge army, complete with cavalry from all parts of the Persian Empire, infantry from all parts of the Persian Empire, and then quite famously scythed chariots, which are chariots with curved blades in the hub of the wheels, and they spin. And as the chariot rolls through a formation of men, they cut off legs and arms and hands and heads and all sorts of things. Terrifying, right? They're one of the most terrifying weapons in ancient warfare. Just when someone writes about scythed chariots, you can tell in the ancient sources they're like, yeah, these are the big guns, right? Those and elephants are kind of like, yeah, we don't know what to do with those. But Alexander, with a much smaller army, faces down this massive Persian horde at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 October. I think it's October 1st of 331. And again, by throwing himself into the midst of the fray, and judicious use of his much smaller but highly cohesive and highly trained army, he's able to triumph over this much larger Persian force. Almost kills Darius III on the field. There's a very famous fresco, or not fresco, a mosaic from Pompeii, which depicts this moment, which is talked about I think in Arrian and in Curtius Rufus, and probably in Plutarch as well, where Alexander is essentially within like a spear length of Darius. I mean, they're looking into each other's eyes when Darius turns his chariot around and runs. And so it's a very personal sort of combat. I talked about that in a previous video. Ancient warfare is very personal in that respect, not just because you're often face to face with the people you're fighting, but because commanders are often either trying to kill one another personally, or they're sending their men with the express purpose of, hey, that's the enemy king's bodyguard, go over there and kill those guys, right? All those guys, and bring me, the guy's body or proof that he's dead or something like that. So Alexander was very much a proponent of that style of warfare. He wanted to find the enemy commander and go toe to toe with them and see which one of them was more of a man. And part of that is just, again, the nature of ancient warfare. But for Alexander, if we're going to psychologically sort of figure out what kind of person he was, part of it has to have been that he believed, as did all Macedonian kings before him, he believed that he was a descendant of Heracles. He believed that the royal house of Macedon was descended from Heracles or Hercules himself. And so the way that he carried himself into battle had to be of a piece with who the Greeks understood that hero, that mythological god man to be. And so Alexander, much like Heracles would have, just threw himself into battle. So the Greeks win the Battle of Issus, or the Macedonians. The sources often just use those words interchangeably. It's not really helpful, but they're interchangeable. So Alexander defeats Darius III, but doesn't capture or kill him at the Battle of Gaugamela. And then Alexander proceeds to capture all of the major Persian capitals and large cities. So these are places like Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, and then the last one is Ecbatana, which is the summer capital. It's up in the mountains on the border of what's now Iran, I think. Pretty sure. But anyway, this whole time he's pursuing Darius. Darius is running further and further eastward into his empire toward what's today Afghanistan. And ultimately, I think he would have retreated all the way to what's now Pakistan. He doesn't reach that far, but he's running. And he's trying to build an army to face Alexander again or come up with a plan or something. Nothing works. And so ultimately, Darius's courtiers realize he's no longer a viable candidate for rule, and they assassinate him in a coup. As Alexander is bearing down on them, they kill him and run away. Alexander fights a couple more Persian pretenders who sort of claim to be the great king of Persia, but at this point he's had himself inaugurated as the great king of Persia. And it's pretty clear to everyone, even the men who are claiming to be the great king, it's pretty clear that Alexander's the guy. And so he conquers the entirety, or at least the western, probably the western 2/3 of the Persian Empire at that stage. And then he pursues the conquest into Afghanistan, what's now Afghanistan. And this is the messiest part of his campaigns. Afghanistan at that point is very thinly peopled, but the people who live there are, if you paid any attention to the post 9/11 war in Afghanistan, the people who live there now certainly would have done their ancestors proud. They are hardy, they are recalcitrant, they are really doughty fighters, and they refuse to surrender for anything. And so Alexander eventually just more or less just resorts to killing and burning everything and everyone. There's no prisoners, there's no negotiating, there's none of it. It's just, all right, well, there's people and they're alive. Let's change that. And so just a really bloody, protracted struggle in the mountains of Afghanistan that, much like the post 9/11 war for the United States in Afghanistan, produces literally nothing of any substance or consequence. Just a lot of post-traumatic stress and a lot of money spent and blood spilt for no appreciable purpose, except, the blood spilling itself. And the vague sense of justice or vengeance. And so eventually he sort of marches his way through Afghanistan. He makes peace with one particular chieftain who has some control over some other tribes, and marries that chieftain's daughter, whose name is Roxanne. That's Alexander's only official wife. He was involved with another woman who bore a son, who actually he named Heracles. But Roxanne is his official wife. Roxanne will also bear him a son, whose name is Alexander the Fourth. And then he will later marry Darius III's sister Statira, and a lot of historians believe that when she eventually dies, which is not very many years from the point where they get married, that she was probably pregnant with his son or daughter. She was pregnant, most likely, when she died. I forget who it was. Someone threw her down a well and blocked up the top of it. So that's horrifying. Um, so he marches out of Afghanistan. He's over that. But that brings him to the Hindu Kush and Pakistan, which in those days was just sort of India. The subcontinent was largely unknown to the Greeks. Um, Richardson, who wrote this book, claims that only one Greek had ever been there, which is a Greek adventurer and explorer named Skylax. I don't know if that's true. I feel like that's probably a little bit of an extrapolation from just the fact that there's only one Greek mentioned in sources who's been there, but I don't know. Certainly, it wasn't a place that Greeks went very often, and so it was a new world to them in many ways. But Alexander basically insists that his men follow him over the Hindu Kush range into what's now modern Pakistan, um, and he is sort of drawn by an unwise alliance into battle with another Indian kingdom led by a king named Porus, who, according to some sources, is like 7.5 feet tall. He's a giant who rides an elephant into battle, so just genuinely terrifying. Um, and he fights what some historians would judge to be his most difficult and most um, tactically impressive set piece battle, which is the battle of either the Jhelum, which is what the river's called now, the Jhelum, or the Battle of the Hydaspes. I prefer Hydaspes because that's what he would have called it. But it's essentially the battle involves a night march. Well, it involves subterfuge, a night march, actually kind of three amphibious operations. His army split into two pieces, uh, fighting a force that is probably larger than his army. So, yeah, he splits his army into, he's got about a third of it with him, and 2/3 of it are with his subordinate Craterus. And both halves, or both parts of the army, are executing um, subterfuge, night marches, and amphibious operations to cross the Hydaspes to get to grips with the Indian army under Porus. And the Indians have with them the other most fearsome weapon of ancient warfare, which is elephants. They have trained war elephants. So not just like, oh, we pulled these out of the jungle, but animals which have probably been raised from birth to be battle creatures rather than just animals. And Alexander, again, is able to come out of that victorious. So he subjugates Porus, and then that leads him to the borders of what's known as the Nanda Empire, which is actually in India itself. And his army at that point says, nope, no more. We're not going any further. We are staying right here. Or rather, we're going home. And so he is eventually forced to return home. He travels down the Indus River into the Gulf there, and then they make their way back to the cities of Babylon and Susa and Persepolis and Ecbatana. He marches part of his army through a desert, and about half of them die. The Gadrosian Desert's one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. Eventually, he reaches the heartland of his empire and realizes that being gone for the better part of 3 years was a bad idea because it's basically all fallen apart. And he spends the last several years of his life trying to sort of pull things together and come up with an heir, which he never really manages to do while he's alive, at least, not explicitly. He has a son while he's alive, I believe, but well, he has a son, but not a official heir while he's alive, and so that causes problems. And he never manages to actually administer, I guess, his empire. It's always just kind of falling apart around him. And then in 323 BC, Richardson claims that he drinks some polluted water, which gives him typhoid fever. Um, there are a number of other possibilities I've heard for what it is exactly that kills him. I've heard malaria as a possibility. I've heard typhoid fever, before. I've heard poison. That was an ancient theory that he was poisoned by someone, and also been revived in the modern day. Um, and then I've actually read an academic paper that claims that Alexander suffered from a very rare autoimmune condition called Guillain-Barré syndrome, um, and that's what ultimately did him in. So he also, I wish I had bookmarked this page. He also engaged in a massive drinking bout before he took ill. He drank like a couple gallons of wine, basically, like a lot of wine. Um, and this was not uncommon. Macedonian kings were hard drinkers. It was one of the ways that they demonstrated that they were like the guy, is by drinking a ton, out drinking all of their men. And so he'd had drinking fights, drinking contests before. Um, in this particular one, it just was too much. He'd received like a dozen different injuries. He'd been hit with rocks. He'd been shot with 3 different arrows, one of which punctured his lung. He'd had his thigh cut open at the Battle of Gaugamela. He almost died from some sort of bacterial infection, I think, in Syria after he swam in a river that he shouldn't have swam in. He had all kinds of problems. And then he was also, at the end of his life, suffering from an immense amount of trauma. His favorite horse, Bucephalus, had died. A huge number of his soldiers, his veterans, had died. And then his boyhood friend, best friend, closest confidant, male lover, Hephaestion, had also died quite recently, when he took ill and eventually died. So he was in a really rough place, and Richardson basically makes the case that he kind of reached his peak after the death of Darius III, and then everything after that was essentially sort of a jumping of the shark, and he was in a bad place and just couldn't figure out a way to get out of it. Um, he uses a Greek word, pothos, which is this sort of feeling of not belonging or alienation, which ultimately leads, in the ancient world, leads people who are feeling it to their own self-destruction or death. And he basically says that Alexander was suffering from that, and that's one of the reasons why he continually throws himself, body and heart and soul, into combat, because he's actually looking to die. So that's Alexander in a nutshell. You can't do it in much more of a nutshell than I just did, and that was a big nutshell. So this book, Alexander, God, King, Man, by Edmund Richardson. Prose, really good things. Number one, he does a really good job with tone and atmosphere, kind of putting you in the ancient world, putting you in the mindset of an ancient. He digs into things like Babylonian astronomy, things that are written in cuneiform, Sumerian religion, and how they were sort of trying to help Alexander survive on the throne, Indian philosophy. There's a really kind of amusing portion, both of the ancient sources and of this book, where Alexander interacts with what are called the gymnosophists, which are the naked philosophers, which are Indians who practice some form of or conglomerate of Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism, which is very ascetic, and so they don't wear clothes. And he takes a couple of those guys into his entourage, and has humorous interactions with them in a variety of ways. So he Richardson does a really good job of finding those interesting little tidbits and inserting them into the narrative of the campaigns of Alexander in places that make sense, and that sort of help illuminate the world a little bit for people who either aren't familiar with it or, like myself, who read 5 biographies of Alexander and don't need to hear again all the stories about, well, Alexander tamed Bucephalus by helping him not be afraid of his shadow, which is true, probably. But every person who writes a biography of Alexander, including Richardson, tells that story. It's just that Richardson tells it very briefly, whereas most biographies will take like multiple pages. He takes like 2, they'll take like 10. So he focuses on things which I think are new or unique, in a lot of really good places, and so that does a lot of good things for the narrative. He does an excellent job of talking about ancient battles. They're really confused. Um, Almost certainly were really confused experiences for the people who were in them. The sources that we have are not direct sources in most cases. And so you're working from the retelling of a person who wasn't there, who's probably getting their version of it from someone who wasn't there, but who was reading a first person account, right? So you're at one or two removes from the first person account. And so Richardson does an excellent job of taking both the ancient sources and sort of modern reconstructions by military historians and saying, all right, here's what is happening, right? Here's why Alexander is moving in this particular direction. Here's what he's hoping to accomplish by forming his army up in certain ways. Um, he talks about at the Battle of Gaugamela, for instance, Alexander forms his army into what is effectively a hollow square. And he puts certain portions of his forces in particular places because he wants to accomplish certain things with them being where they are, right? So the phalanx is, spread out in the front, but then portions of it on the left are a little bit more heavily reinforced because he knows that he's going to leave them out to dry while he rushes off with the right wing of his army to go and kill Darius. So things like that. And he does sort of a step by step or a blow by blow in those battles. That's really good. It's hard to explain without you actually just reading it. I'm not doing a great job of it because I'm not him, but highly recommend that. In particular, I would say his explanation of how the Battle of the Hydaspes plays out was probably the best version that I've read. It's really clear. Um, it makes sense of a lot of things in the original sources that are kind of like, what is that, or why is that? Um, so yeah, just does a great job with those, and makes them fast paced and exciting without turning them into like a Michael Bay movie. It's not Transformers. There aren't explosions, but you're still getting a sense of excitement from them. So that's really good. He also, I think, shed some light on aspects of Alexander's campaigns and travels that don't necessarily get forefronted typically. Um, he talks about the historian Callisthenes, who's a great nephew of Aristotle, who goes with Alexander to sort of tell the story. Um, and does begin to do that, although his history doesn't exist today. Unfortunately, hasn't come down to us, but he eventually gets mixed up in a plot and gets himself crucified. And that's in the ancient sources, but he does a good job of telling that story within the broader context of what's going on and explaining why it happens and what it would have meant to Alexander to kill the man who was telling his story, right? To a man who, when he's trying to do sort of this psychologizing of Alexander, what does it mean to kill the guy who's trying to show who you really are, right? Like, what does that do to you? Maybe in a Freudian sense, although this is not a Freudian psychology kind of book or something like that, but that's kind of the idea. He spends a lot of time on the campaign in Afghanistan. The Afghan campaign is really weird because there's a ton of fighting and a ton of bloodshed, but there aren't set piece battles because it's between 200 Macedonians and 40 Afghans, and so it's not a battle, it's a skirmish. Um, but he does a really good job of pointing out that the army at that point really descends into darkness and atrocity and cruelty and madness a little bit. They don't know what they're doing there, and Alexander basically just tells them, "Hey, kill everything," and that's what they do. And so it's a very dark time. They've lost sight of sort of a guiding star, which is conquer the Persian Empire. They've already done that, and so they're kind of questioning what they're doing. And Alexander doesn't seem to have a good sense of what they're supposed to be doing, and so they revert back to the fundamental nature of the soldier, which is kill the bad guy. So really interesting in that regard. And then I already talked about the gymnosophists, but there's also really humorous mentions of Diogenes the Cynic, who's a ancient Greek philosopher in the time of Alexander, who lives in an old wine barrel and essentially lives like a dog, which is where the name cynic comes from. Um, and one time, according to some of the ancient sources, Alexander goes to see him, and he's just thinks that Diogenes is kind of funny, but also like, hey, you really got something going on. He's just there's no affectation in your life. You just live, man. And he says, "Is there anything that I can do for you?" And Diogenes is sitting there outside of his wine barrel, just kind of chilling. And he says, "Yeah, you get the heck out of my sunlight," because he's sunbathing naked. Um, and Alexander's like, "Huh, that's hilarious," and then he gets out of his sunlight. So things like that, where they again add color to the world. They help you understand what these people would have been like, and also I think that story is something that even moderns can be like, "Oh, that's kind of funny," and the Gymnosophists as well. Why is it that all these philosophers are taking off their clothes? That's weird. There's probably a paper that you could write about that. Probably a paper you shouldn't write about that, but it's in there. Anyway, this book is rarely boring. That's what I found. Again, even having read several books about Alexander, I was not finding myself being like, yeah, I've read that before. I'm going to skip this page. I'm going to skip this account. Like, I was interested to read what he had to say, um, even when he wasn't writing about Alexander himself, um, even when he shifts away from the main narrative. So, really good in nearly all respects. In terms of cons, it's not a very good psychological portrait of Alexander. Again, I don't know that that's actually what the book is for. I kind of understood that that's what it was, but maybe that wasn't the point. He does try, I think, to give you a sense of Alexander's headspace. And in some places, I think he does okay with that. Um, but he paints him as a much more uncertain, kind of callow youth in a lot of places. And I just don't get the sense that Alexander was really ever uncertain. Um, or at least if he was, it would never have been apparent to anyone because that was not the public persona that he showed to the world. Um, and so Richardson will make some assertions and some claims about, well, Alexander was, unsure here, or he was afraid here, or he was feeling psychological distress here. But he can't really support those from the sources. They go largely unsupported from the sources because the ancient sources don't really make that case, and modern sources, that's just someone else's assertion. So he makes a case, much like he claims Alexander dies from typhoid fever. He makes a very good case for that, but there are other cases to be made, right? Poison, Guillain-Barré syndrome, malaria, alcohol poisoning. So it's not that his claims about like, well, Alexander was really unsure what was going to happen before the Battle of Issus. It's like, well, yeah, maybe, but also he was Alexander the Great, and maybe he just was not inside his own head in the way that Richardson claims he was. So it's 6 of one, half a dozen the other. There's no way. There's no way to prove that he's wrong about it. It's just that he doesn't have a good way to prove that he's correct about it. And so any psychologizing he does feels very much like opinion, which isn't necessarily wrong. It's just that if this book is meant to psychologize Alexander, it can't do that, or at least can't do it conclusively. So I don't know. It didn't meet an expectation that I had, but I don't know if that was a legitimate expectation to have in the book. So there's that. Um, he has a lot of interesting asides: Babylonian astronomy, Greek philosophy, Indian philosophy, how to build boats, just all sorts of things. Some of them are a little bit distracting. Some of them feel like filler. I don't think that was the intent. I don't think he was actually like, okay, well, I'm going to talk about horoscopes here and how that's based on Babylonian astronomy because I'm trying to fill up pages. I think he just thought this is actually part of what I'm trying to tell, and so I'm just going to talk about this. But some of them don't land as well as others. Yeah, so it you might not notice it if you read the book. Um, he also, this is just a personal pet peeve. He does the flash forward, flash back technique that made the Alexander movie that came out in the early 2000s. It just killed it. People could not understand what the story was doing because the movie did not follow the narrative of Alexander's life in a chronological way. It just jumped all over his life, in these disconnected remembrances of his general Ptolemy. Um, and so it made it super hard to follow for somebody who hadn't already read a book like this and knew, well, actually, not a book like this, a book like Arrian's Anabasis of Alexander, which goes in chronological order. Um, and so he does that at the beginning of the book. That's the only place he does it. But he starts with the Battle of Issus, which is the second of Alexander's major battles against the Persians, and takes place, I think, a year after he comes, or no, 2 years, 1 or 2 years after he becomes the king of Macedon. Um, and of course, at that point, he's already 23 years old. So he tells you that he leaves Alexander, standing on this hilltop at the battle, right before the Battle of Issus. Maybe he might actually tell you how the battle goes. I don't remember, but you're at the Battle of Issus at the end of chapter 2, I think, or chapter 1, and then he jumps all the way backward and explains the context and tells you about Alexander's birth and all these things, and then works his way back up to the Battle of Issus. But there's no, in my opinion, there's no real reason to start with Issus rather than one of the other battles. Or, better yet, if you're trying to psychologize him, to start with a moment like when he becomes a god in Egypt. So yeah, it it's meant to draw you in really quickly by being like, hey, there's a battle. But I think it's honestly a little bit of just like sleight of hand that really doesn't contribute very much to the book. I would say, honestly, the weakest two chapters of the book are the first two because of that device, narrative device. So there's no real purpose to it that I can see, and it doesn't contribute to the book in a meaningful way, in my opinion. So there's that. But overall, Alexander, God, King, Man by Edmund Richardson. Really good, really accessible biography of Alexander the Great. It's very interesting. It's really readable. Even for somebody who's never read about Alexander before, it does a really good job, I think, of telling people who don't know anything about Alexander things that they need to know, and people who know things about Alexander stuff that they didn't already know. And so it's a very good um, middle of the road biography where it's not just like an intro level popular biography that is riffing off of a movie or something, but it's also not super dry and academic and uses the Greek without translating it or something. um, it's really good in that respect that it caters to multiple groups of people. So I do highly recommend that you read it. It's really good. um, it's a good intro to the subject of Alexander, but it's probably not the last word on him. So, yeah, I think that's all I have to say about it. So, I'll see you next time. Go and read something, maybe something about Alexander the Great.